My daughter sent me a voice message meant for her husband, and what I heard made me freeze in my chair because it wasn't anger or secrets I heard first. It was laughter, soft and careless, the kind she used to have as a child when she felt safe, and for a moment I almost smiled, thinking maybe I was wrong to open it, maybe this would be something sweet. But then her voice changed, lowered, hardened, and she began talking about me, about her own mother, as if I were a burden she had finally learned how to carry without guilt. She said my name the way one speaks of unpaid bills or old furniture, something you tolerate until you can replace it, and she told her husband how exhausting it was to deal with me, how my sacrifices were dramatic stories, how my illness was probably exaggerated, and how once I was gone, life would finally feel light. And as I listened, my hands trembled, not because I was surprised, but because every sentence confirmed something my heart had feared for years but refused to admit, that the child I raised with sleepless nights, with skipped meals, with prayers whispered over her forehead, had slowly learned to see me not as her foundation but as her obstacle. And the worst part wasn't the complaints. It was the jokes, the way she laughed while describing how she would send me voice notes just to keep me quiet, how she called me emotional when I cried, how she planned holidays with the money I once saved for her education. And as the message continued, I remembered the nights I stayed awake sewing her clothes, the days I walked miles so she could attend school, the moments I swallowed my pride to ask relatives for help when her father left us, and I realized that love, when given without boundaries, sometimes teaches people not gratitude but entitlement. And when the message ended, I didn't cry immediately. I sat there in silence, staring at my phone, realizing this wasn't a mistake she made. This was who she had become when she thought no one was listening, and that hurt deeper than any argument ever could, because arguments mean emotion. But this was dismissal, and I wondered where I failed, whether kindness had been mistaken for weakness, whether my silence had taught her that my feelings didn't matter. But then something inside me shifted, not into anger but clarity, a calm realization that I had spent my life proving my worth to everyone except myself. And that night I didn't confront her. I didn't send angry messages or dramatic replies. Instead, I saved the voice note, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that love does not mean self-erasure. And the next morning when she called me sweetly, asking if I was okay, I answered gently with the same warmth I always had. But this time with boundaries she could hear but not yet understand. I stopped explaining myself, stopped apologizing for existing, stopped giving money I couldn't afford, and slowly, quietly, I began choosing myself. And weeks later she noticed the change, how I no longer rushed to respond, how I no longer begged for her time, how my voice had grown steady. And when she finally asked me why I seemed different, I didn't mention the voice message. I simply told her that mothers, too, get tired, and that love should never feel like humiliation. And for the first time, she was silent, because some truths don't need proof. They need time, and whether she ever admits what she said or not, that voice message changed me forever, not by breaking me, but by teaching me that even a mother has the right to be respected, heard, and valued, especially by the child she gave everything to. After that quiet shift in my life, days began to move differently, slower yet heavier, because once you hear truth spoken freely, you can never unhear it, and every small interaction with my daughter started to carry echoes of that voice message. The casual cruelty hidden beneath politeness, the affection laced with convenience, and I noticed how our conversations revolved only around her needs, her complaints, her plans, while my words floated unanswered like background noise. And for the first time I allowed myself to observe instead of excuse, to listen without defending her in my mind. And what I saw was painful but undeniable. A daughter who had grown accustomed to my availability without considering my humanity, and as weeks passed, she began to feel my absence even though I was still there, because I no longer filled the gaps she refused to acknowledge. I no longer rescued her from every inconvenience, and that absence unsettled her more than my presence ever had. She called more often, not out of concern but confusion, trying to restore the balance she benefited from, and when I didn't respond the way I used to, her tone sharpened, then softened again, cycling between irritation and sweetness, and watching that pattern unfold was like watching a stranger wear my child's face. And one evening she came to visit unexpectedly, sitting across from me with forced warmth, scanning my expression as if searching for clues, and she spoke about her stress, her marriage, her exhaustion, never once asking about mine, and suddenly I realized how invisible I had become in her world, not because I lacked value, but because I had always made myself small enough to step over, and in that moment I felt an unfamiliar strength rise within me, not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that refuses mistreatment. And when she finally asked why I had been distant, I looked at her, really looked, and answered calmly that distance sometimes grows when respect fades, and my words startled her, because she wasn't used to hearing truth spoken without apology, and she laughed nervously, brushing it off, but her eyes betrayed discomfort, and later that night I sat alone remembering the mother I once was, the woman who believed love meant endurance, who thought patience could heal everything, and I grieved her gently, because she deserved rest. And from that day forward I began rebuilding my life piece by piece, reconnecting with friends I had neglected, taking walks without guilt, spending money on myself without justification, and slowly my world expanded beyond waiting for my daughter's calls. And as my independence grew, her resentment surfaced, subtle at first, then sharp, accusing me of changing, of becoming cold, of forgetting my role, and that accusation cut deeply because it confirmed what she truly believed, that my role was service, not selfhood. And still I remained silent about the voice message, because I understood now that confronting her would only invite denial or tears designed to reverse my growth. And months later, during a family gathering, she made a careless joke about me in front of others, echoing the same tone I had heard in that recording, and something inside me finally settled, not with rage, but acceptance. The acceptance that love cannot survive where respect is absent. And that night alone, again, I listened to the voice message one last time, not to punish myself, but to measure how far I had come. And I realized that the woman listening now was no longer the one who first heard it, because pain had taught me boundaries, silence had taught me strength, and loss had taught me self-worth, and I understood that whether my daughter ever realizes the weight of her words or not, my healing no longer depends on her awareness, because sometimes the hardest lesson for a mother is learning that raising a child does not guarantee a place in their heart, but choosing yourself guarantees peace, and that realization, though painful, was the beginning of my freedom. As time moved forward, I began to understand that healing is not a straight path, but a series of quiet choices. And one of the hardest choices I made was allowing myself to remember without romanticizing past, because every memory of my daughter now arrived with two versions, the child she once was and the woman she had become, and holding both truths at the same time felt like carrying glass in my chest, yet I learned to breathe around it, and strangely, the less I tried to earn her love, the more I discovered my own voice, a voice that had been buried beneath years of caretaking and compromise, and I started noticing how often I had minimized my pain just to keep peace. How many times I had smiled through disrespect because society praises patient mothers but never protected ones, and in recognizing this, I stopped blaming myself for her choices, understanding that love plants seeds but cannot control how they grow. And one afternoon she called me crying, saying her marriage felt empty, that her husband didn't listen, that she felt unappreciated, and as I listened, a painful irony settled in my bones, because she was describing the very loneliness she had handed to me so carelessly. And for the first time I did not rush to fix it. I did not offer solutions or reassurance. I simply listened, and when she finished, waiting for comfort, I told her gently that feeling unseen can change a person, and my words lingered between us like unfinished sentences. And after that call, something shifted in her tone toward me, not warmer, but uncertain, as if she was realizing I was no longer predictable, and unpredictability frightened her more than anger ever could. And months later, she asked me directly if I was upset with her, and I answered truthfully that I was no longer angry, because anger still expects change, and that startled her into silence. And I saw then how unfamiliar emotional accountability was to her, because I had shielded her from it her entire life, and in protecting her feelings, I had taught her that mine were optional, and that realization carried both regret and relief. Regret for the years lost to silence, relief that it was not too late to stop disappearing, and gradually I stopped shaping my life around her reactions. I celebrated small joy. Alone, I laughed freely with people who saw me as more than a role, and I felt myself returning, not as the mother she needed, but as the woman I had neglected. And yet, despite all this growth, there were nights when grief arrived unannounced, when I mourned the daughter I thought I had, the future I imagined where love would circle back to me, and I allowed myself those tears without shame, because acceptance does not mean absence of pain. It means refusing to live inside it. And one evening, long after the voice message had stopped haunting me, she sent me another recording, this time meant for me, her voice cautious, measured, telling me she missed how close we used to be, and I listened carefully, noticing what was said and what was not. There was longing, but no accountability, affection, but no acknowledgement, and I realized then that reconciliation without truth is just another form of silence, and I responded kindly but firmly, telling her that closeness requires honesty, and honesty requires courage, and whether she ever finds that courage is no longer something I can control, because my role now is not to wait, not to beg, not to endure quietly, but to live fully. And if one day she truly listens, not just hears, I will be here as a mother who loves, but no longer disappears to be loved. And that understanding, earned through heartbreak, became the strongest boundary I had ever built, not against my daughter, but for myself. Life did not suddenly become peaceful after that realization, because boundaries, once drawn, invite resistance before they bring respect, and my daughter resisted in ways both subtle and sharp, sometimes through silence that felt like punishment, sometimes through sudden affection that felt rehearsed, and I learned to recognize the difference, understanding that manipulation often wears the costume of love, and there were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe I was being too hard, too distant, too proud, because mothers are conditioned to believe that self-sacrifice is the highest form of virtue. But each time I felt myself slipping back into guilt, I remembered the sound of her laughter in that voice message, the ease with which she dismissed my pain, and it anchored me to truth. And slowly my world reshaped itself around quieter joys, morning tea without anxiety, evenings without waiting for calls that never came, conversations that did not revolve around proving my worth. And I realized how much of my life had been lived in anticipation of approval that was never guaranteed. And as I grew steadier, my daughter grew restless, because people who benefit from your silence rarely applaud your strength. And during one tense visit, she finally asked me why I had changed so much, why I no longer needed her the way I used to, and I answered honestly that needing someone should never mean losing yourself. And my words unsettled her, because they challenged a dynamic she had relied on without question, and in her discomfort I saw not cruelty but immaturity, a woman who had never been taught that love includes responsibility, and for the first time, instead of blaming her entirely, I felt compassion without surrender, empathy without erasure, and that balance was new to me and weak. Later, she confessed that my distance scared her, that she felt like she was losing me, and I told her gently that I was not disappearing. I was standing still for the first time in my life, and that frightened her because she could no longer move me where she wanted. And as months passed, relationships settled into something unfamiliar but honest, less frequent, less intense, but more real. And though she never spoke of the voice message again, its shadow lingered between us, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what unspoken truth can do. And there were days I wondered if she truly understood the weight of her words, and then I accepted that understanding is a journey she must choose on her own, just as healing was mine to choose. And one evening as I watched the sun set alone, I felt a quiet pride, not in endurance, not in sacrifice, but in survival with dignity, and I understood that motherhood does not end when children grow up. It evolves, and sometimes evolution means letting go of the version of yourself that lived only to be needed, and embracing the version that exists simply to live. And if one day my daughter listens not with convenience, but with conscience, I will welcome her with honesty instead of excuses, because love that demands silence is not love, and love that survives truth is the only kind worth keeping. And that, finally, is the lesson her voice message unknowingly gave me, a lesson I will carry not as pain, but as power. By the time I reached this stage of my life, I no longer measured days by how often my daughter called or how warmly she spoke to me, because I had learned that peace does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly when you stop negotiating your worth. And in that quiet, I began to notice how much emotional noise had once filled my days, the constant anticipation, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the careful wording meant to avoid her irritation, and it stunned me to realize how normalized that tension had become, as if love was something fragile that needed constant adjustment to survive. And once that pressure lifted, I started living more honestly, speaking when something hurt, remaining silent when words would only invite misunderstanding. And this balance confused my daughter deeply, because she was used to a mother who bent, not one who stood still, and there were moments when she tested my resolve, bringing up old favors, reminding me of sacrifices she believed entitled her to obedience, and each time I responded calmly, refusing to argue history, because love is not a ledger and motherhood is not a debt contract, and my refusal to engage did more than any confrontation ever could. It forced her to sit with her own expectations, and sometimes that made her angry, other times quiet, but always thoughtful. And during one rare, honest conversation, she admitted she didn't know how to relate to me anymore, that she felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, and I told her gently that growth often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. And though she didn't fully understand, she listened, truly listened, and that was new. And as time passed, I noticed subtle changes, less dismissive jokes, fewer careless remarks, longer pauses before speaking, as if she was learning that words leave marks even when they are spoken lightly. And I did not rush to celebrate this progress, because healing is not proven through moments but through consistency. And still, there were days when grief returned, when I missed the closeness I once imagined we had, and I allowed myself that sadness without romanticizing the pain that came with it, understanding that nostalgia often edits out the hurt. And one afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, I found photographs from years ago, images of a younger me smiling beside a little girl who held my hand tightly, and instead of breaking down, I smiled softly, realizing that love existed then in its purest form, and that it was okay to honor that without demanding it return unchanged, because people grow, relationships change, and clinging to old versions only deepens loss. And as I placed the photos back, I felt gratitude, not for what was taken from me, but for what I had survived, and I understood that motherhood is not measured by how much you are needed at the end, but by how much strength you pass on, even if that strength is first used against you. And if my daughter now walks through life more aware of the weight of her words, more conscious of the hearts around her, then perhaps this painful chapter had meaning beyond my own healing. And as for me, I no longer wait for apologies that may never come, because closure does not always arrive at confession. Sometimes it arrives as self-respect, and in choosing myself without bitterness, I reclaimed a life that had been paused for far too long, and that choice, though born from heartbreak, became the quiet victory that no voice message could ever take away from me. In the end, the story did not close with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful apology, because real life rarely offers such neat endings. Instead, it settled into something quieter and far more honest. A mutual understanding shaped not by words spoken, but by behaviors changed, and I came to accept that my daughter might never fully acknowledge the harm her voice message caused, not because she is heartless, but because facing the pain we inflict requires a courage many people take years to develop. And I no longer waited for that courage to appear, because waiting had once been the shape of my entire life, and now I chose presence over hope, living each day grounded in who I am rather than who I am to someone else. And in doing so, I felt a peace that did not depend on reconciliation or validation. And when my daughter and I spoke, there was space between us, not distance, but breathing room where respect could grow without being forced. And sometimes I caught glimpses of change in her, a softer tone, a pause before dismissing, a moment of reflection that told me the seed had been planted even if it had not yet bloomed. And I learned to appreciate those moments without clinging to them, because love that heals is patient but never self-destructive. And as I moved forward, I realized that the voice message, once the sharpest wound of my life, had become its greatest teacher, revealing not only who my daughter was in that moment, but who I had been for far too long, a woman who believed endurance was the same as love, and releasing that belief freed me in ways I never expected. And now when I look at my life, I do not see a story of betrayal, but one of awakening, a reminder that even mothers are allowed to grow, to set boundaries, to demand respect, and to choose themselves without shame. And if one day my daughter fully understands this lesson and meets me there with honesty and humility, I will welcome her with open arms and clear eyes. And if she does not, I will still walk forward with dignity, knowing that my worth was never meant to be measured by someone else's. Understanding and that truth durned and deeply personal is where my story finally finds its peace.